In 1972, we bought a property which formed the basis of Heytesbury Stud, which still is where my family breed horses. All but about 10 acres of this 700-acre property had been cleared, and even those 10 acres had been logged for jarrah and blackbutt early in the 20th century. Gully winds like the easterlies that I'd grown up with were a regular feature of our day at the stud from October till about April, and of course the danger of bushfires was also with us again and ever present. And that's where my tree planting life began in earnest, particularly of the Eucalyptus citriodora, a throwback to the box of natives which I'd been to collect with my father 30 years before. Many of the seedlings and plants came from the very same Hamel nursery, still at that time being run by the West Australian Government Department. By now I had a few children and their introduction to the bush commenced. They helped plant trees from a very early age. We left an island in the middle of one of the many dams we built, and we stocked it with marron, which is our West Australian freshwater crayfish. Our boys and their friends had countless adventures camping on the island, living off those marron. Boiled marron, fried marron, stewed marron, barbecued marron, and no doubt burnt black marron. Or later, when they were a little older, they were left up to their own devices to go and camp in the bush at the top of the farm where the clearing had not been complete. So 4 more idyllic childhoods immersed in the jarrah, marri, blackwood, banksia and xanthoria of the West Australian bush. The national park adjoining the stud was a mass of blooms in the wildflower season, so there were 4 more young people searching for kangaroo paws. Other properties followed in Western Australia and Victoria, and my husband indulged my planting addiction and allowed me to go a bit mad as well. In Victoria, I took a very different path with the stud we developed here. I'd been coming to Melbourne for many, many years and realised how magnificent the autumn and spring could be here, with colour changes taking place that we had no hope of in Perth. We don't have a cold enough winter or autumn. So I decided to plant elms and ashes, oaks, poplars and so on. A dreadful mistake. I allowed myself the luxury of a few Eucalyptus citriodoras, but I think within a few years they'd reached heights which those elms and ashes still haven't reached 30 years later. I do believe, though, that the elms and the oaks with their leaves full of water survived the recent Victorian bushfires far better than the oil-charged eucalypts. At the end of the 1980s, my husband and I purchased several pastoral properties in the Kimberley region of Western Australia and the Northern Territory, and among them was the great vast Victoria River Downs station, which was once reputedly the largest cattle property in the world. By the time we bought it, it was much smaller, having been subject to an Indigenous land claim. The magnificent Victoria River runs for 100 kilometres through Victoria River Downs, and when we took possession in 1989, the banks for the whole 100 kilometres were severely degraded. This photo shows one of the road trains coming across the Dashwood crossing, and you can just see that there's a little bit of a degradation of the banks, but not too bad, as we've been able to do some work which I'll describe. But many of those 100 kilometres of the river were dreadfully degraded. And it was at that time that I discovered how conservation and care of the environment can come together to bring about financial advantages. One of the very big expenses which we inherited at VRD was for helicopter time, not just for mustering. In the extreme dry season, very heavy, pregnant old cows would climb down the degraded banks to get a drink from the ponds that were remaining, and they would become stuck in the mud and couldn't climb out of the river with their huge tummies full of water. So we inherited this, but the previous owners had a system whereby helicopters were chartered to fly down the river and, would you believe, shoot the old cows that had become stuck. Absolutely disgraceful, absolutely inhumane, dreadfully expensive, and terrible for the already degraded banks. A very silly way of running a business. The solution that we adopted was to fence out the river on both sides, about half a kilometre from the banks. We then installed pumps and water troughs and left the 100 kilometres, 100 kilometres long and kilometre wide strip of banks to regenerate. And it is extraordinary how fast this regeneration took place. Within a few years, the banks were looking the way you could feel quite proud of rather than ashamed. And the accountants and the shareholders, of course, thought that was pretty fantastic because they weren't paying for the helicopter time. And the environmentalist in me was ecstatic because we had restored 100 kilometres of ruined water edge. From 1980, Victoria here was to be the home of the Holmes family for a large part of the year. My 4 children were all educated here, and each of them spent a year at Timbertop, the Geelong Grammar School home for Year 9 students. Total immersion in the Australian bush again, but this time, a very different kind of bush. Timbertop is above the snow line in winter, as many of you will know, and it promises great adventures and great opportunities to get to know and love the exhilaration to be had from adventures in the mountains. Also, of course, the fear and terror of fire. My daughter, in fact, missed an entire month of her Timbertop experience due to the school having to close for quite a period during the dreadful Victorian fires in 1983. I still spend a great deal of my life in Melbourne, and I'm proud of the 5 million plants lining the East Link or Connect East project, which John Holland, the company I chair, planted in the last few years when we were developing this, I say freeway, in fact it's a tollway. And as well as planting the 5 million trees, we developed 75 wetland areas along the 35 kilometres of the road to reprocess the water which runs off a road such as this and to protect the environment along the way. At home in WA for their school holidays, my children continued their exploration of Western Australia, its national parks, with trips to the Karri forests in Pemberton, the Valley of the Giants, in the Tinglewood Forest. This is a photo of the wonderful treetop walk in the Tinglewood Forest, right down on the southwest coast of Western Australia. They continued their adventures at the stud in the bush, and when they'd finished their schooling, they wanted to do things like walk in Tasmania, continue their adventures in WA, climbing Bluff Knoll in the southwest. They had marine park adventures, swimming with whale sharks on the Ningaloo Reef, and a very sad and fruitless experience with a trip to the southwest of Western Australia, trying to encourage a pod of beached whales to return to the ocean.